Also, when these variables were collected and on which groups of participants. In terms of what data is available, WHI includes participant data from questionnaires, which are mostly self-reported and categorical in nature, as well as from clinical exams, outcomes that are both self-reported and confirmed by adjudication, and test results from biospecimens. In terms of when data was collected, the original WHI study ran from 1993 to 2005 with screening and enrollment of participants between 1993 and 1998. Since then, there have been 2 extension studies with continued data collection and outcomes assessment. With each extension, the consent rates to continue with WHI have been very high, with more than 75% consenting for each extension. In terms of who the data was collected on, some data was collected on all WHI participants, but some data was only collected on subsamples of participants, and data generated from ancillary studies is only available on the subset of participants selected for those studies. Before diving into more specifics about the who, what, and when of available data, I want to show you some resources on the WHI website, specifically the Working with WHI data page. On this page, you will find a wealth of information about WHI data. I will talk individually about many of these resources in more depth throughout this video, but want to share their locations first. First is the user guide to WHI data, which gives information about data preparation and the use of data in analyses. There's also information about the frequency at which different WHI data forms were collected, as well as a table showing how different participant characteristics were collected over time. Fully searchable data dictionaries are also included on the website. Access to the data itself requires a WHI account, but access to the data documentation is available for all. And finally, you can also find information on which data items are not available for download, as well as information on how to proceed if any of these items are necessary for your project. Before looking more closely at the data, let me highlight the design of the WHI study. WHI consisted of 3 clinical trials, a hormone trial, a low-fat dietary modification trial, and a calcium and vitamin D trial. An additional group of women were enrolled in an observational study component at the same time that clinical trial enrollment was taking place. It's helpful to understand the study design when working with WHI data because the motivation for data collection for each component of WHI was different. Data was collected during the clinical trial to assess primary and secondary outcomes and monitor safety and adherence. In the observational study, data was collected to examine associations of known risk factors to disease, as well as to explore potential new risk factors. In the extension studies, data was initially collected for the purposes of long-term monitoring for the clinical trials, but has since shifted to focus on aging-related questions such as physical functioning and activities of daily life. WHI data falls into many general categories, and from these you can see the breadth of the type of data collected in WHI. In addition to more standard items like demographics and medical history, we have data on diet, psychosocial and personal habits, and medication and supplement use. Our outcomes data includes both self-reported outcomes and those confirmed by adjudication. We also have genetic and analyte data resulting from our specimen collection. Here you can see some of the key forms used to collect data on different topics. Full data dictionaries for each form, as well as the actual form itself, are available on the WHI website, and we will look in detail at how to access this information next. Data dictionaries on the WHI website provide detailed information and summary statistics for each variable available in our WHI datasets. These data dictionaries have search functionality using the search box in the upper right-hand corner of the page, which returns search results from variables in the data dictionary, as well as searching the WHI website more broadly. The data dictionaries are organized by topic and can be navigated by clicking tabs along the top of the dictionary. Demographic information is contained in a single data file, and other data files are organized by specific form. For example, if we look at the baseline tab, we see that Form 30 contains information on a participant's medical history. If we were to click on the link for this form, we would see the data dictionary for the Form 30 data file. Let me point out a few of the features of each of these online dictionaries. First, the top of each dictionary page gives the name of the data file, the population of WHI participants the data was collected on, and the time frame of data collection. Here we see that this medical history form was collected on all WHI participants in both the clinical trial and observational study at baseline. We also see that this data file contains 1 row of data per participant, and that the number of rows is roughly the same as the WHI study sample size of 161,808 women. So a small percentage of women in the study are missing data from this form at baseline. Each data file will also include the WHI common ID, which is the unique identifier assigned to each WHI participant. This variable can be used to link data across data files. Another commonality for WHI data files is the inclusion of a days since randomization or enrollment variable. Rather than providing dates for data collection or outcomes, all data is indexed to the date of randomization for the clinical trial or enrollment for the observational study. This allows data to be temporally aligned without the need to release specific date information. Within the data dictionary, you can also always click the PDF icon at the top of the page to open up the actual data collection form to see exactly how the questions on the form were worded. Here's the actual Form 30 used for data collection. We can match the questions here to the questions in the data dictionary. So consider this question about overnight hospitalization within the past 2 years. We can match this question back to the data dictionary as the variable HOSP2Y. From the usage notes, we can learn this variable wasn't collected on all versions of Form 30, so some participants who filled out a Form 30 form will be missing this variable. The summary statistics give a quick assessment of how much missing data there is, as well as frequencies of the different question responses. Let's look at one more data dictionary example from the Measurements tab. In this case, Form 80 provides information on physical measurements and was collected during WHI clinical exams. Clicking on the link to access this dictionary, we see a similar format as before. In the informational section, notice that this form was collected not just at baseline, but also during the main WHI study time period. We can also see this through the fact that each row in the dataset corresponds to a form rather than a participant, and the number of rows in the dataset is much higher than the number of WHI participants. For longitudinal data like this, in addition to the variables of WHI common ID and days since randomization or enrollment, we also get additional information about the type of visit and the visit year for the collected form. We can see in this case, most forms were collected at baseline or screening, or during annual visits, and the visit type and year variables can be combined to create longitudinal data for a participant over time. In the event that multiple forms were collected in the same year for a participant, 2 additional variables provide information to help users determine which visit to select. The user guide to WHI data provides full details on how to appropriately select the data for the visits that you need. When considering longitudinal data, it's important to know which variables were collected at which time points. The frequency of data collection tables available online summarize this information for each WHI form. These tables are organized by WHI phase. This tab shows the frequency of data collection for the main WHI study. The legend below the table, shown here, helps decode the groups used for data collection. For example, we see that Form 30, medical history, was collected on all WHI participants at baseline, whereas Form 33, which updates medical history, was collected on all participants annually during the 9 years of the original study. This note also specifies that in the clinical trial participants, the data was actually collected every 6 months and again at closeout. Considering data on personal habits, Form 34 was collected initially on everyone at baseline, and then further data was collected using Form 35 only on clinical trial participants in years 1, 3, 6, and 9. Switching to the tab for Extension 2, which is the current extension since 2010, we can see the pattern of data collection in later years. As before, medical history is updated annually for all participants. We also see in this extension that there was a WHI long life study home visit in 2011 for a subset of participants. This home visit involved a blood draw, a brief clinical assessment, and an assessment of functional status. Finally, we see that the data on activities of daily life was collected annually on Form 151 during this extension. Although this form was not actually collected in 2011, the same questions were asked on Form 155 during that year. Because of this potential for data on the same characteristic to be collected on different forms over time, we also have a document showing participant characteristics over time on our website. This document is organized by topic and cohort, so clinical trial versus observational study, as well as by phase of the WHI study. So highlighted here would be the original WHI study. The numbers in the table give the form that the characteristic was collected on. I know it's small to see here, but we can see that age was collected in both the clinical trial and observational study on Form 2 at baseline. But let's zoom in for a better look. Let's consider the characteristic of physical function. We see data on this characteristic was collected at baseline on Form 37 in both the clinical trial and the observational study. In the clinical trial, it was also collected on everyone at year 1 and closeout using Forms 37 and 38. For a subset of the clinical trial, it was also collected using Form 38 at years 3, 6, and 9. And for participants in the observational study, it was collected on Form 38 at year 3. Moving to the first extension, data on physical function was collected on Form 151 annually in both the clinical trial and observational study participants. And in Extension 2, data on physical function continued to be collected annually on Form 151, with the exception of year 2, or 2011, when it was actually collected on Form 155. This matches what we saw when we looked at the frequency of form collection over time. WHI collects and publishes outcomes data that is updated annually with new reports of outcomes. Some of these outcomes are based solely on self-reported data, while others have been adjudicated for confirmation. At the beginning of the original WHI study, outcomes in the clinical trial components were defined as being of primary or secondary interest, as shown in this figure. Designated outcomes included coronary heart disease, hip fracture, and various cancers. Because of these designations, many outcomes within the clinical trial cohort were adjudicated for confirmation. Fewer outcomes were adjudicated within the observational study cohort, although the same process was used for outcomes collection. The adjudication process in WHI begins when an outcome is self-reported on Form 33, the medical history update. From these self-reports, medical records are obtained for selected outcomes. Then the adjudication process either confirms or denies the self-report. One thing to note is that WHI publishes only the best possible data source for each outcome. This means that self-reported data is not published for outcomes that are adjudicated. Additionally, adjudication has changed over time in WHI. Starting in 2010 with Extension 2, participants in WHI were split into two cohorts, a medical records cohort containing all participants in the hormone trial and all Black and Hispanic participants, and a separate self-report cohort containing everyone else. In the medical records cohort, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and death outcomes continued to be adjudicated, while in the self-report cohort, only cancer outcomes have continued to be adjudicated. Details on adjudicated outcomes over time can be found in the user guide to WHI data. This table from that guide shows changes in adjudicated outcomes by WHI phase and study cohort. Using the table legend, we can see how things have changed over time. Looking at the cardiovascular outcomes of MI and stroke, we see that these were adjudicated through 2010, or Extension 1, for all cohorts, but since 2010, they are only adjudicated in the medical records cohort. Looking at breast cancer, however, we see this outcome continues to be adjudicated for all cohorts through 2023. In addition to adjudicated outcomes, WHI has a wealth of data on self-reported outcomes, as summarized on this slide. Self-reported outcomes fall into three groups: specific conditions, exams or procedures, and medications or treatments. Details on how collection of these outcomes has changed over time can be found in the user guide to WHI data. In terms of accessing outcomes data, we provide summary files of outcomes in a standard format. For each outcome, these files contain variables that give outcome information on the participant level. One variable indicates whether or not the outcome has occurred since enrollment in WHI. Another variable gives the number of days from enrollment to the first occurrence of the outcome for those participants who had the outcome. And finally, if the outcome is adjudicated, a third variable gives the source of the verification of the outcome. WHI also provides detail files for adjudicated outcomes with further details about each participant's specific case. Dictionaries for these detail files are available in the WHI data dictionaries. The last piece of understanding WHI data is to understand which participants the data was collected from. Much WHI data is available on all participants, such as baseline data from screening and medical history data during follow-up. Some data, however, is only available on a subsample of WHI participants, based on a sampling scheme defined at the beginning of the WHI study. And finally, other WHI data is only available on a subset of participants. For example, bone density measurements were only done at 3 clinical centers, and many specimen results from ancillary studies are only available for participants selected into that particular study. Full definitions of WHI subsamples can be found at the link on the top of this slide. I will highlight one such subsample here, the core blood subsample, also known as W1, or the 6% CT subsample. Although blood was collected at multiple time points for both the clinical trial and observational study cohorts, only a subsample of participants had their blood analyzed for 20 specific analytes at baseline in years 1, 3, 6, and 9. This subsample, which consisted of roughly 8.6% of the hormone trial and 4.3% of the diet modification trial, was purposely constructed to oversample non-white participants. Because of this sampling scheme, use of subsamples requires adjustment and analysis to report results that represent the whole WHI cohort. In addition to the main WHI study, many core WHI sub-studies and ancillary studies have collected and reported data on subsets of WHI participants. This slide highlights a few such studies. The Long Life Study, or LLS, was a core study consisting of an additional in-person visit to collect a blood draw, perform a brief clinical assessment, and assess functional status. These visits took place during 2012 to 2013. This study enrolled just under 8,000 women from the original WHI cohort. The Life and Longevity After Cancer study, or LILAC, was an ancillary study to look at factors affecting life and longevity after cancer diagnosis, and so collected data on a cancer survivorship cohort. And the WHI Memory Study, or WIMS, was an ancillary study that investigated the relationship between hormone therapy and dementia in a cohort of women aged 65 years and older. On the WHI website, you can find a full listing and more details about the ancillary studies that have worked with WHI participants, as well as what data is available from these particular studies. One more topic related to ancillary studies involves the specimen data from the WHI biospecimen collection. WHI maintains a collection of specimens collected at various time points. Core WHI studies and ancillary studies have used these specimens to investigate a variety of research questions and have reported specimen results back to WHI. Non-genetic specimen results are available within the WHI website, and genetic data are available through the dbGaP mechanism. See the links on this page for more details. For non-genetic specimen results, there's a searchable listing of results available within the WHI data on the WHI website. This listing links to the documentation for using the specimen results and is fully searchable for specific test results. Clicking on the link for an individual test will pull up a summary of participant results along with information about quality assurance. Finally, we should let you know that there are some variables collected on WHI participants that we cannot release to users. These include personal identifiers, our real participant or clinical center IDs, any specific date, location data such as geocodes, and raw or derived data from linked Medicare files. However, some of this data is available for use within the WHI Virtual Data Enclave. See the link at the bottom of the slide for more details about how to access this data. Now that we've done an overview of the data available from WHI, let's talk about how to access this resource. Access to the data on the WHI website requires an approved paper proposal through the WHI Papers and Presentation Committee. Once a paper has been approved, authors can submit a signed data use agreement and receive access to download WHI data files. Data files are formatted as tab-delimited text files that can be imported with a user's choice of statistical software, although SAS programs for import and formatting are also provided. But what can you do if you don't have an approved proposal yet? You can plan for your paper proposal. If you are planning for a paper proposal, you can make use of the WHI data documentation described here without full data access. This documentation can provide information about which variables are collected at which time points and on which participants. Additionally, rough information about available sample sizes can be found by looking at the statistical summaries in the online data dictionaries. For example, we can see that there have been about 1,500 pancreatic cancer cases during WHI follow-up. For more granular information about sample sizes, the WHI Query Builder allows users to perform simple queries to get counts of participants by demographic categories, study components, clinical outcomes, and more. To summarize, there are a wide variety of resources for working with WHI data on the WHI website, particularly on the Working with WHI Data webpage, many of which we've talked about in this video. You can also find information about the process of proposing a WHI paper at the Propose a Paper webpage. Finally, I want to highlight the wonderful resource of the WHI Help Desk, which is available to answer your questions about WHI study data, WHI policies and procedures, and more. If you have questions while planning your paper proposal, please reach out to the Help Desk for assistance.